So in the last section, we figured out how to render a button, but it appeared that our styling was not correctly being applied. So we have our developer console open over here, and reading the last error on here, it says unknown DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So this is the first little gotcha that we're going to come across here, one of several, and I'll walk you through each one as they come up. But this particular one, as we render this HTML, we are passing in the class name for this button and the class name for this span right here. And these are just normal, CSS classes. Well, when we're working with JSX in particular, this class is a keyword that in JSX can actually refer to this type of class, a component class as opposed to a CSS class. So just like this error message says, maybe we mean class name. Well, that's absolutely correct. Whenever we're working with DOM elements in JSX, instead of designating a class or a list of classes, we designate class name. So we can change both of these to class name. We'll save it. And great. So our error message is gone, and it looks like our button is appearing, just as we would expect. All right. So now we have a button on screen. It's styled correctly, but it still has static content. So as a reminder, the purpose of this section is to figure out how to use properties or configuration options that we're going to provide to this component when we render it to customize how it looks and behaves. So converting this to a dynamic component, going from static to dynamic, being able to customize messages in this number right here, is a three-step process. The first step is in our JSX template, we're going to replace any text that we want to be dynamic with curly braces and a JavaScript reference to this.props. This.props is like an object that every instance of a class has. So at any point in time, I can refer to this.props, and in this case, it's just going to return an empty object because I haven't passed this component any props when it gets rendered yet. The second step, and don't worry, we'll walk through, of course, what each of these steps in detail. The second step is that we're going to create an options object when we pass our badge into the create element, and we're going to pass that options object in as the second element or second argument in here. That object that we pass in is going to be available inside of this component as this.props. So that's step 2. And then step 3 is we're going to pass the object's element into the create element method. So we create the options object before, and then we actually pass it into this create element method right here. So let's start at step 1. We're going to replace our text with a reference to this.props. And at first, this might look a little bit funky, but bear with me, and we're going to walk through it in detail. So I'm going to, I know that I want messages and the number 4 to be dynamic, so I'm going to replace both of them with curly braces and reference to this.props. So I'm going to delete messages. I'm going to put in my curly braces, and I'm going to say this.props.title. And title is a somewhat arbitrary key or property here. When we create our options object, it'll be a little bit more clear what's going on. So I'm going to delete the 4 and replace it with curly braces and a reference to this.props. So this.props.number. All right. Step 2, I'm going to create my options object. So I'm going to say var options is an object. And these are the options that are going to be passed into this render, or be available inside of this render function. This object right here is going to be what props is inside of my component. So I'm going to say title is inbox. And then I also make reference to number. So I need number, and I say number is 32. All right, so this is step 2. I defined my options object that has the same key as I make reference to inside of my template. So I have this.props.title, which matches up with title, and then props.number, which matches up with number. Step 3, I'm going to pass this options object into create element as the second argument. So I'll say options. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh the page. And sure enough, inbox and 32. I can then say sent, and maybe I've only sent 12 emails. And sent and 12. All right. So what the heck is happening here? Well, whenever, remember the analogy that we used at the start of this section. My class is my cookie cutter. When I do a create element, that's like my cookie. I'm spinning off my copy here. And then the options are like the sprinkles or the icing or that last little step of configuration that I put on top. So when I create an instance of badge, I pass it these additional options. Then inside of my class up here, I can make reference to those options that get passed in. So you can imagine that whenever I make my component, I want to have very special consideration of, well, what properties am I specifically making use of? What keys am I making use of? Because any other developer, or even you in the future that's coming across this component, is going to need to have a reasonable idea of what these properties are named, right? So in this particular case, we chose title. Well, I probably don't want to choose something like hat or something like that, right? I can make these anything that I choose, but I want to make sure that they're property names that make sense in their context. All right, so let's reiterate on what we've figured out here. So we create an options object, we pass it into create element. This options object is now available inside of this component as this.props. And then I can insert properties out of that this.props object into my template by wrapping it with curly braces. Just really quick, let's see what happens when we don't include curly braces. Right, so it's this.props.title. Because as far as React is concerned, that's just some arbitrary text that you want to be included inside of the HTML snippet right here. So anytime that you have single curly braces, React is going to look at that and say, oh, this must be JavaScript. I need to execute this JavaScript, and then whatever gets returned from that is what's going to end up inside of the HTML. Great. So let's move on to the next section.